The DLC Nightfarer Scholar, who is an arcane support-based character, has received a couple of new gameplay trailers showing off his abilities. And although we don't have all the information, there still are some things that are worth speculating and discussing. First off, starting with his passive ability, Bagcraft, said to store additional resources, level up the power or effect of items by using them. Now, just based on the first part alone, that is already a great passive effect. My interpretation is that we will be able to hold more in one pouch. So instead of 2 of every item, we can now hold potentially 3 or 4. I'm hoping for being able to hold 4 stone sword keys, 4 boiled crabs, maybe 2 wending graces in just one pouch is fantastic. But there's also another side to this passive ability that levels up these items by using them. We do have a couple of examples to show, one of them being this gravity stone chunk that comes alongside a gravity pulling effect, and you can tell that this is different because the first time it was thrown, it didn't have that pulling effect. So it's either that it is a timed buff for every single time that you use a consumable, or to what is more likely, after using these consumables a certain amount of times, it will be permanently upgraded, and hopefully all future pickups will come upgraded too. I don't think it will be a timed buff because it also implies to level up an effect, meaning that it should work with things like Exalted Flesh and Boiled Crabs, which those are timed buffs, so it would be kind of silly if this passive effect was also timed. Now, I do believe that this would only work for consumables and would not work for those infinite use tools like a Wraith Calling Bell. I feel like they made it this way to incentivize people using more of like the throwing pots and perfumes and, actually make use of those stupid talismans that we have. But speaking of the throwing pots, this can actually be a very big deal because in the first trailer, we see a lightning pot explode twice. Now, my initial thought is that this had something to do with his character ability and having enemies like get hit twice over, but since this new trailer, the second explosion is most likely just his passive effect, leveling up a lightning pot. And if this pot is exploding twice, then it could very well be doing twice as much damage. Now, there's always a chance that the second explosion is doing less damage, but assuming that it is doing double damage, pots can end up being crazy, especially if you can be able to hold twice as many. And we can actually calculate how much damage an optimized pot throwing build can be like. A normal lightning pot does roughly 150 flat damage, does not scale with any level or your stats, but it can be increased with relics, such as the consumable boosting relics. Every one is a 15% damage increase, and with 3 of them, you're getting well over 200 damage, and if that hits twice, you're getting closer to 500 damage, which that is basically like the Recluse using Shattering Crystal. But in Deep of Night, there are actually enhanced versions of these consumable relics, and the +2 versions offer 35% more damage. And with 3 of those, in combination with the other stuff, we can be doing over 1100 damage for one singular pot throw. Which, for a comparison, a Recluse with all these magic buffs, using the Rolana's Full Moon on a gold carrying Regal Scepter, also does 1100 damage. And having that damage be in one singular pot where you can hold up to 20 of them and throw them pretty quickly, yeah, it can be kind of crazy. Now, to pump the brakes a little bit on that one, this is being done with a lightning pot, assuming that it is going to be doing double damage. Which, 1, it might not be doing double damage, and 2, lightning pots are not easy to come by. You'll have to go to lightning points of interest just to reliably find them. The only consumables that you can guarantee to buy an infinite amount of are fire pots and throwing knives. And who knows if the fire pots end up working the same way in that they explode twice. And even if they do, it's still going to be doing less damage than a lightning pot while doing pure fire damage, which is a lot more enemies that are resist to fire damage. And if you are going to go with a pot throwing build, you want to be able to constantly stack up on these pots and buy them, which can end up costing tens of thousands of runes, which that might not be much of a problem once you do get to day 2, but the later that you go in an expedition in day 2 and day 3, the more the pots will end up falling off in terms of damage, because as I mentioned earlier, they don't scale with your level at all. And also, all this damage was assuming that you have all of these relic perks, which is going to take RNG, and also that's going to mean potentially sacrificing other good relics to run these ones, which might not be the best play because pots are still going to be secondary to your build. The primary stuff that you're going to be using would potentially be sorceries and status effect weapons, which I'd rather have my relics be dedicated towards that, and we don't know how good his character relics are going to be. If his character relics are really good, then those are more relic slots that we're potentially sacrificing. So despite their potential being really high, it might not be the most consistent thing. I don't see him turning into like a primary pot throwing character, but honestly, that's perfectly fine. This is just a passive ability. And as I've mentioned, just being able to hold more items is good enough. And having all these item bonuses and another way to potentially play the character on top of this is just a great addition. I'm very excited to start making some pot, perfume, and throwing knife builds. Now, as for his main character skill, Analyze. Study your enemies. The longer you observe, the better your combat advantage. Now, there is a lot going on here. On activation, you go into a stance that highlights all these enemies and allies within this circle. And upon looking at these enemies, the circular mark will begin to fill up. And the closer they are towards you, the quicker it will fill up. And when it is completely filled, you will gain access to certain abilities and effects. Now, despite the description saying the longer you observe, the better your combat advantage, I still think that you have to see the circle completely fill up just to be able to gain a benefit. I don't believe that you can end it early and still apply an effect. And I came to this conclusion because you can see that in the second trailer, the scholar starts to use his skill and the bar is already almost filled up. And this happens twice, whereas in the first trailer, the bar was empty. So that leads me to believe that when you stop using the skill, it saves your progress and then you can be able to pick up where you left off. Or it could mean that the bar fills up in other ways, or it could mean that I am completely wrong and you still can use the ability early to gain a smaller benefit. But yeah, there are two separate actions being used in this trailer. There is an enemy debuff and a self buff. So this is probably going to be another similar situation to the Revenant character skill that has a drop down selection, but instead of summons, you're going to have buffs and debuffs. And who knows, there might end up being more than two options. One of them might end up being a damaging option. But to first get into the debuff applied, we see the enemies get hit with a white and a red debuff. The red debuff looks identical to those debuffs that have the enemies either take more damage or deal less damage. They all have that same stripe effect, but just a different color. It could end up doing both debuff effects like Grail's Roar, but I'm not going to have much of an opinion on it until I see the exact numbers. But what's more interesting is this white debuff, because this doesn't look like anything else that we've seen, and it seems to like explode on a hit. So maybe they end up getting debuffed to take more damage or more stance damage on the next hit. But another thing that it might end up being is a slowing effect. We see the enemies move in slow motion right as they're about to hit this Duchess, and the video isn't slowed down at all because the throwing pot is still moving at normal speed, and when I speed the video up, they still look very slow. Now, this could be From Software slowing down the enemies purposefully for the trailer, but forgetting to slow down the rest. Because what's also interesting is that in the second trailer, there isn't any slowing effect shown at all. So who knows exactly what this does? At the very least, I do think that it is going to be them taking a bit more damage, because every single time that they've showcased this debuff, it's the enemies also getting hit too. So it's probably them taking more damage. But as for the self buff that we see, this is also doing two separate things. One is adding a bubble over the character, and the other one adds this green effect, which I'm assuming is going to be some type of stamina buff, either an increase to your stamina bar or stamina recovery speed. But this bubble also seems to do a damaging AoE when hit. And there is a very good chance that this bubble also does get applied to your allies if they are in line of sight, which might explain why they also do get highlighted too if they're standing within that circle, which being able to keep your allies alive with a bubble is honestly just insane support. So hopefully it does work that way. Now, it also does look like a parry effect too, because like the character does slam his chest at the exact same time the attack lands. But that honestly might just be a coincidence because the bubble does actually spawn in before that even happens. But if it is like a perfectly timed thing that does result in an AoE explosion, then that is pretty cool. If that actually was the case, then maybe it could also end up staggering Night Lords too. But I don't think that this is a parry. I am intrigued to see the exact numbers for these before I formulate my own opinion, but having a character skill fill multiple different roles means that it's going to be useful in many different circumstances, which a problem that a lot of character abilities have in this game is that some of them tend to be very niche, but this one Definitely is not. But lastly, getting into his ultimate art, Communion, damage is shared by linked enemies and can heal threaded allies. Unlike the first two abilities, this one seems very straightforward. The only questions that I have is that do the linked enemies take 100% of the damage, and does it work with things like Restage or Iron Eye Mark? In terms of the healing effect that it has, that's pretty cool. It honestly just seems like a reskinned version of the Recluse ult, because Recluse's ult also has enemies take more damage and can heal allies, but it also does heal FP, and both ultimate attacks do go very far. But Recluse's ult might just directly outclass it, because hers also does do damage, meaning that it's also going to be doing revive damage, and it does do a bunch of stance damage too. But it is going to be a lot better than the Scholar's ultimate attack in a solo boss fight, because there's no other enemies to take this shared damage. But I don't doubt there will be some type of really cool character-specific relics out there that gives the Scholar an additional debuff to his ult to make him good for solo bosses, or even like actually have him be able to revive allies too with it. That could be pretty cool. But in terms of the rest of the stuff that we do see in the trailer, they did show off a whole bunch of Shadow of Erdtree enemies, which some of them are very annoying and going to be a problem in Depth 5. But hopefully that means that we do end up getting some new Shadow of the Erdtree weapons, although I'm not too hopeful in that regard. His brand new moveset was shown off a little bit, but there really isn't much to note, other than it might be somewhat similar to like a light greatsword moveset with combinations of pokes and swiping attacks. And also his feint attack looks like it gets iframes, which is pretty cool. Which, if you don't know, if you cancel your thrusting sword heavy attack, it does do this like backstep retreating animation called a feint. And normally it doesn't get iframes. But yeah, not really sure how useful that one's going to be though. However, my overall thoughts is that I am very impressed. All three of his abilities seem very useful, and none of them seem basic by any means. Which, if you are going to be selling 2 characters in a $15 DLC, having these characters be like higher skill ceiling and a bit more complicated is always going to be welcomed, but I am very much looking forward to seeing his character relics and his stat spread. I don't really foresee this character having like the highest amount of damage. He might just end up having average stats across the board when it comes to damage and survivability, which honestly is perfectly fine because his abilities seem fantastic. But if you are interested in any of my opinions for when the character does get released, definitely do subscribe, because I will be making character reviews and builds. Anyway, catch you guys in the next. See yas!